other shelter options in the community. I think trafficking-specific shelters are needed, probably specific to the population. So you need shelters for adult women, you need shelters for adult men, and you certainly need shelters for child victims. Sex and, you need shelters that are specific to the types of trauma that they've survived, I think, per gender, per age. Right now we don't have that, and it's because of resources. We don't have the resources for it. So we do the best we can by utilizing other shelters in the community, but also private housing. So we utilize apartments, private homes, whatever option seems the most feasible for that client, given any safety concerns, given any resource restrictions, how much access we have to resources for that client, given their location. Frequently, trafficking survivors are relocated for various reasons. Sometimes the relocation to a new community is completely about safety. Sometimes it's because they can access resources better in maybe a more urban area or in a certain part of the state. And so we consider all of those things when we consider where the victim will be housed for ongoing services. And it's completely with the consent of the client. We ask them what they would prefer to do. And that's what happens, is what the client wants. Even if it's not what we necessarily think is best, even if it's not what we would recommend, we explain what the different options are and then let them choose, because we think choice is so important. And so we really follow that in all of our services. We explore all the options, let them know what all the options are for them, and then let them choose what it is they want to do. The other big service that we don't provide in-house is therapy services. We do not have our own therapist. I'm not a therapist. We do case management and advocacy, but we utilize other therapists. Therapy is a huge need. It's a long-term need. It's not a need that clients want to utilize right away or even recognize right away. Actually, when we first get clients, frequently they're in sort of emergency management mode where all they can do is think about today. How do I survive today? And they need food and clothing and a place to stay and medical care maybe for something that's emergent. So we provide all of those things and then let them know about options like immigration legal services or therapy, and we let them choose when they'll participate, but we continue to offer it. We utilize contract therapists oftentimes, or we utilize therapists at different crisis centers, whatever is appropriate, whatever that client would qualify for based on their history. Because certainly we know that there are certain nonprofits in different communities that maybe work with victims of sex-based crimes, like Great Crisis Centers or DV shelters, and they might have certain therapy options that could be utilized for sex trafficking survivors or survivors of labor trafficking that involve sexual violence, right? So we utilize those resources whenever, but we also use our own contract therapists who are very experienced in trauma-based therapy, specific to refugees, torture survivors, and trafficking victims. But they're not an in-house therapist. So those are probably the two biggest services that are a frequent need that we really collaborate with the community. I would say the other common need among really the broad span of trafficking survivors is various legal services apart from immigration. So you might have family legal issues, you might have criminal legal, or the need for civil legal representation. And so we are working on collaborating with various attorneys who would do that for us pro bono because it's so expensive. So really, we can't pay for those services. Most of our funders won't let us pay for those services with our funding. And of course, those are expensive services and the client can't afford them. So we're frequently seeking pro bono attorneys to do that work for all these different legal needs that clients have, apart from the immigration, which we do provide. So I would say maybe those are the three big services that we really always are looking to collaborate on and find out what's maybe the best fit for that particular client, given that we don't have it in-house.
Sure.
And maybe over time, as resources hopefully continue to increase, we'll be able to do some of that in-house or have shelters and see how that works.
I mean, would you recommend that there be, like you said, the specific shelters for all one, would you recommend the specific counseling that's specifically geared to trafficking and the issues that go with just trafficking?
I mean, I think that certain interventions are really needed for this type for this trauma and for this population. So, for instance, our contract therapist uses a lot EMDR as an intervention in her therapy, and that seems to be really effective with this population. And so, but it's also used with other trauma survivors. So, I think there's some crossover. And research seems to suggest that trafficking trauma, the compact trauma of surviving trafficking, is similar to torture and being a survivor of war. And so I think some of the interventions used with that population for PTSD would certainly make sense. Maybe with some tweaking, right, for this population. I think also there's something to be said for support groups as a treatment option. Support groups made up of survivors, where survivors, because what we hear a lot from our clients is that there's this big sense of isolation, that you feel isolated because of the trafficking that happens to you, and you were isolated in so many ways, but also you feel like you're the only one who's lived it. And of course, the typical case management practice is complete confidentiality and privacy and separation from other clients. But what we're finding out is that there seems to be great value in survivors meeting one another on certain occasions or at a certain point in their recovery, like in their sort of in their case management, and using that as a treatment option for them, especially with teenage survivors of sex trafficking. There seems to be a lot of value in that population, meeting one another, having time together that's facilitated, and that maybe follows a curriculum like My Life, My Choice. So we're hoping to adapt that into Kentucky and use that as a treatment option for that population.
But currently now, the agency you work with does not do that. Only if therapy or the therapist recommends that, right?
Well, there's no one doing that here. We do have the therapist that
you
we
would just get the survivors together if they say they want to.
I have not done that. I have not done that yet. We're working towards that. So right now we're getting training. We brought in the folks from Justice Resource Institute in Boston who developed the My Life, My Choice curriculum, which is a support group model for teenage survivors of sex trafficking. We've had them come train us and bring the curriculum to Kentucky. And so we have the curriculum. They're coming back to train us again because this seems to be one of the few and one of the effective options for a support group model. They're using it around the country, and so we feel like this is a good place to start. What we're hearing from the folks because now in Kentucky, it's actually the cabinet who's mandated to provide primary services to minor victims. Right. So I do work with minors, but I'm not the primary service provider by law for minors anymore. It's the cabinet. So the cabinet utilizes our services when they need something supplemental, but it's the cabinet that's mandated to provide the majority of the care, basic needs, and that sort of thing. What I'm hearing from the cabinet is that the difficulty for them is finding enough behavioral health resources for these folks, and also having appropriate shelter options. That seems to be two of the major difficulties in serving this population of minors. So we want to offer them some good treatment options because when these kids get in front of a family court judge for whatever history they've had, or they're in the front of a criminal judge in the juvenile system, when they're looking at this child's case and the idea that there's trafficking history, we want them to go have a route to trauma-informed care and services instead of detention, but there needs to be some treatment options. So we want in Kentucky for there to be this option of saying, I'm going to mandate that you go to the support group for 10 weeks at your treatment facility. I'm going to send you to X treatment facility where you're going to attend that as part of your treatment plan. You will attend this, and it's mandated, because I think that for that population sometimes you do have to mandate things. But we can't mandate it if it's not even available.
Right.
So what we're hoping to do is, once we get folks trained, which we're still working on, utilize that curriculum, the My Life, My Choice, and have it available on a pilot basis in a few different settings throughout the state, and see how it goes. See if it seems to be successful, if folks seem to be responsive, and see if we can then continue to adapt it and utilize it in different types of locations. So we're planning to start it in at least one treatment facility, have it in the DJJ facility where folks are actually detained, and have it maybe in some other sort of shelter-based residence, maybe a group home or something it's not a treatment facility, and see how that works as a treatment option. So we're looking at that because we feel like that there's a lot of value in that for this population.
Sounds great.
Yeah. So and I think right now there's not a curriculum for boys; it's only for girls. So we'll start with the curriculum for girls. And then hopefully folks are going to be working on a curriculum for male survivors, and hopefully we'll do better at IDing them because we're really not IDing them well either. And then we'll be able to expand it. But that's just some of the challenges, I think, in sort of being the first folks doing this work locally, is that it's almost like you just figure it out as you go, and you look at models in other states and say what seems to be successful in other states and what does the research suggest, and you do the best that you can, and you adjust it as you go. You listen to what your clients are telling you and what they need, and figure out ways to provide for them what they're telling you that they need. But the two big, I think, gaps are the need for shelter services and for this behavioral health intervention, and we don't have enough of that here. We also need more folks doing the case management. It is not sustainable to have two bodies in one office in one city doing this work. I mean, the rape crisis and domestic violence centers, now I recognize they've been around for years now, 20 or 30 years they've been established in our communities, but they have regions, and there's 13 to 15 of them around the state. That's not even enough probably to serve that population, but at least it's a model that seems effective, that you have them placed in different communities throughout the state, rural and urban, including shelters. I mean, it seems to be needed that way, and it seems to be effective to some extent, even if it's not quite enough.
Sure.
I can see how trafficking would be very similar. I can see how we would really have a need to have different shelter options available throughout the state, and serving these different populations of trafficking survivors. In some communities you might have more foreign national workers, and so it makes sense to maybe have more services available for foreign nationals, because that's a community where there's more foreign nationals present. Maybe in the urban areas you might have more child sex trafficking victims, and so I think you look at the community and you look at the demographics and say what services would be most reasonable to have here. But I think we can look at the rape crisis, domestic violence model, and sort of say that makes sense. It makes sense to start that way and have it available in the community, as opposed to only having it in Louisville, which is kind of, our office is there. That's where the physical services typically are. And then we travel everywhere and do piecemeal sort of what's available in your community. Okay, if you don't have this, then I'll send a therapist to go to your, that's not sustainable. So we do the best we can, but that's not enough. Then the question becomes resources. You have to have resources to be able to increase that at all.
Sure. Yeah.
So the chicken and the egg sort of thing, it's this big quandary, and we don't know the answer.
Yeah, unfortunately, that is true.
And unfortunately, Kentucky is just in an unfortunate position because we get overlooked so much at the federal level. For trafficking work, a lot of the federal dollars go to places like Houston and Dallas and Miami and New York and Los Angeles and these major cities that are points of entry into the United States, or Toledo, or border cities, and Kentucky's often overlooked, but it doesn't mean we have any less a problem per population. It seems to be that we have just as big a problem with trafficking here per population as these other places do, but it just means that we get overlooked a lot in regards to resources and funding, and so we have to, the burden is on us to sort of make it work.
Yeah. That's a lot of work. What are your aftercare procedures for a human trafficking victim or survivor?
So the first thing that we do is actually we actually ensure that the screening process happens. So that'd probably be the first thing. So unless they've already been screened by somebody who's been trained by us, that we know that they've been able to screen and make that determination on whether or not they meet that definition, then we do provide the screening ourselves. What we don't like to do is do a secondary, we don't want to put the victim through going over all of that again. And so when we get the referral from whomever, that's the first thing we ask about is, well, how much do you know? How sure are you do you need us to ask something additional or find out more information about what's going on, or do you feel like you know enough? And then we ask for their documentation because our funders require it. We need to have it on file showing that they meet the definition because that's the population that we serve. So where we start with services depends on what's happened so far. How much information does that referral source have or know, and how much can they share with us? Because the more they can share with us, the less we have to put the survivor through. And we'll start from wherever we have to start. We do sort of work under the belief that in our case files, less information is better. Because while our state law provides confidentiality of our information, like a therapist, the same sort of, I'm not using the right language, but
I understand
that protection of your records, they can't be subpoenaed, for example. It doesn't mean that there couldn't be a way to get around that, or that it couldn't be a federal case in which we don't have any protections. And what we don't want to have happen is that we wrote down a bunch of detailed information about the trafficking incidents that could somehow be seized by somebody or subpoenaed and used against the client in some way. I would never want for me to have on my records that my client said to me they were assaulted 3 times on X day, and then later it turns out that they say something different to an attorney and that could be used against them. So we try not to keep a lot of details of the trafficking in their file. We do a screening, or we utilize the screening that the referral source gave us. And we keep that information, and we basically keep enough information in their file about the trafficking just to know that they meet the definition. Right. And so it's pretty basic, and we try to keep it from being very detailed with specific dates or specific numbers, because we wouldn't want it to cause any problems to the victim. We never know where that case will go. So most of the information that we keep on file is about the services. And we keep some identity documents in there, about the client as we get them. We keep on file referral information that we make and services that they get in the community. If they get to a point where they do have official documents, if they make an affidavit for their visa application, we'll keep the affidavit on file. Now that's a public record, so we keep that because we want to make sure we have it. If they make a civil complaint, we'll keep that in their file. If they make a police report, we'll keep all of those things because now those are public record. But what we try not to do is to make our own documents about with their statements in them that are separate and could be different in some way. So most of our information in our file is about the services. What services do they receive, the financial documents, all the things our funders require when they monitor us. That's the majority of what's in their file. And the things that show the different sort of case management services that we provided, which differs by case because all the needs are so different.
Yeah.
So we start with the screening. Once we determine that they've met the definition of a trafficking victim, then we sort of do a needs assessment and say, how can I be most helpful to you? Because just because they're a survivor doesn't mean that they necessarily need our program. If it was 15 years ago and they're self-sufficient now, maybe they don't really need services. So we assess the need for services. Is there something that I can be helpful with? Whatever that might be. And then we just start from there. And we determine what are the most immediate needs. What do you need today? What do we need to plan on and make appointments for you for? Who do we need to connect you to make sure you get what you need? And then the other big consideration at the beginning is safety issues. So we try to determine, again, we don't want a lot of detail, but we try to determine is there a current concern about danger? Right. Are your traffickers present? Do they know where you are? We talk about whether or not this has been reported to law enforcement so that we know sort of where that stands. We certainly recommend folks report to law enforcement, but we don't require that and we don't push it. We talk about what the benefits could be of talking to law enforcement because we think that's very important as service providers, but we certainly let the survivor make those decisions. We only do mandated reporting when it's a minor. Adult survivors have that choice always about who they want to report to and when. So we talk about that with them. And then based on those things, based on the dialogue we have with them, then we decide where to start providing services. And we don't give them a time frame, and there's not a lot of paperwork that they have to sign. Some of our funders require their signature on certain things, just saying that they give us consent to work with them. But really we try to keep it as little red tape as possible. It's really quite simple. When I sit down with them, I try to keep it from being complicated. and then we just start going, and we adjust the service plan as needed, depending on how quickly things go and how well they do. And sometimes the survivor might leave services for a while and come back, or put the brakes on things, or say I'm not quite ready, and we do what they want to do.
So can they contact you on their own
Yep.
afterward?
As a matter of fact, we sort of have an unwritten policy where we don't pursue them; they pursue us. So while we might reach out to them at the beginning to let them know about us and what services we provide, after that we really leave it up to them. We'll make appointments based on what they need or say that they want, and then if they don't show, we might follow up with them and say, "We just want to make sure you knew that you had a therapy appointment this week. Are you still interested?" If they say yes, we'll make another one. If they say no or don't respond, we leave it and we let them call us, because it's really what they want. We're all about self-determination and them making their own choices. That's really important to us, and so we let them call the shots. While I might call them and just check with them and say, "How are you?" especially if I'm worried about their safety, if they seem not interested in services, we'll have that discussion with them and say, you don't have to. It's up to you. Do you want to let me know when you're ready? And then they do. So
That's awesome.
yeah, so we let them they drive the car.
Except the minors are a little different, though.
Minors are very different, and the cabinet is the primary service provider for that. If I get a report about a minor myself, I do the mandated reporting also to the cabinet, to law enforcement, and then we intervene on their behalf. Yeah, there's a lot less choice there.
So, what are the specific aspects of the assessment piece? Like, what are the assessment needs that you see come up most often? And you've talked about a couple of those.
Yeah, so I think the first assessment is regarding whether or not they meet the definition. That's the first thing we assess for. We assess for safety. That's the other main concern, and then we assess for needs. Those are, if you have to categorize them, that's what I would categorize them as. Do they meet the definition? Are there safety concerns, and what are their needs?
What are those categories of needs that you can remember off the top of your head?
Basic needs like food, clothing, personal care items, shelter, legal needs, including immigration legal needs, language access, basic health care, mental health care, advocacy. Sometimes clients just need advocacy. They just want to make a report to law enforcement and they don't know how to do it, and they're scared to do it. And so some clients have just very specific needs. Like they know exactly what they want to do. So I have clients that they're okay. They have someone who's helping them support their children, and they're working, or they're able to provide those basic needs. They just need me to help them make their report to law enforcement and submit them in interviews and interpret for them. So it's whatever they need. So advocacy sometimes is simply what someone needs. I would say it's most of them.
Okay, yeah.
I could be forgetting something.
No, you're fine. Let's see, you kind of shared that. Any specific protocol that your agency adheres to for the aftercare services? You've already sort of shared about getting a referral and that they have to meet that definition.
Yes.
Is there any other specific things that your agency has to adhere to
Yes.
provide case management?
So the agency, so I work for Catholic Charities. The agency requires that in order to share their information, that they sign a release of information for me and specify who I can release that information to. Sometimes my funders require a consent form be signed, consenting to get services from us, but we only do that based on the requirements of the funder. So we follow the funding, whatever the funding requirements are. The agency policy is basically make sure that you follow the regulations of the funder. We have a confidentiality policy, and so we follow that. I really can't think of any other ones.
Now, before the new law that was just enacted about the minors, you handled all the minor cases up to that point, didn't you?
I handled whichever ones were referred to me. I mean, our cases are completely based on referrals. So for example, what we were seeing historically is that a lot of minor victims either wouldn't be identified as having been trafficked, it would be generalized as child abuse.
Okay.
And be reported to the cabinet anyway because it was caretaker abuse. It just wouldn't be ID'd for the trafficking. but I would hear about it later maybe. Or it would go to a children's advocacy center and there'd be a forensic interview or something, and I would hear about it after that.
Okay.
So if there was some sort of disclosure of trafficking, or someone ID'd the trafficking, sometimes I would find out about it, and they would ask me for some sort of assistance on referrals or some sort of service. But typically, I mean, the system in place for providing services for abused children is already pretty comprehensive, and so many of the children would get services in some way if they were seen as a victim.
Sure.
The problem we're having is that many weren't ID'd as victims; they were ID'd as perpetrators in some way, or as criminals in some way, status offenses, whatever. So they would frequently go to the justice system, and those kids were never ID'd. And then you have the whole issue of non-caretaker trafficking that would completely fall through the cracks, and those kids would never get ID'd either, and were completely invisible. So there are so many cases of children I really wouldn't get. So no, I would say child victims were definitely the minority among my cases that I would get, that I would provide direct services to. Yeah, because it would really require one of those primary child services providers to bring the case to me. Because someone has ID'd as having been trafficked, they're not going to call me. So I've always been much more likely to get the adult victim, much more frequently.
Yeah, just looking at your assessment procedures and then moving into your case management procedures, like, are there any different categories that need to be addressed more at the assessment piece than maybe moving on to case management?
What do you mean categories? Sorry.
Well, like the health care or the mental health or anything like that, or you just assess for everything and then based on that assessment determines your case management plan?
Yeah, we assess for all of that. Yeah, okay. So we ask about any of those, and we, based on the response from the survivor, and their own self-determination, we determine what we will provide for them. Okay. I mean, even if it seems like they have mental health needs, if they choose not to pursue those, then we, of course, don't mandate them.
Right. Unless now, if it's a minor, under the cabinet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can require it as part of the treatment plan in their treatment facility. Yes, so it just depends on what category they are, what demographic they fall into as to sort of how they're approached in their treatment, in their case management.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just very case by case.
Yeah. So what are the training pieces needed for persons in your agency to provide aftercare services?
There's not very much training. We're the trainers, so we just that training is a big, if you're going to be the actual case management provider, usually you have to get, if you're going to get trafficking specific case management training, you usually have to reach out nationally. And there are some great organizations that provide, webinars and things that are doing this work and have been doing the work longer. So there are some organizations now that have been doing the work for 15 years, and they're considered sort of the experts. Right. And so we don't want to recreate the wheel. We go to them and we participate in their webinars and utilize their resources. So we reach out nationally a lot. And then I would say locally, we're able to sort of utilize some local resources that are, specific to crime victims. So we're able to, if there's any, the Attorney General's office has some crime victim specific conferences and trainings. We utilize those because there's a lot of crossover. These are victims of crime. We utilize the trainings provided by the Rape Crisis and Domestic Violence Centers. A lot of those interventions, a lot of those trauma needs are very similar, and there's a lot of overlap. And so we recognize the value in those and attend those trainings and actually have really great collaborative relationships with those organizations. And so we do a lot of crossover. So we train for them, they train for us, and
that's awesome.
Because there's a lot of value in the training that they provide. So we utilize that as much as we can. So we sort of piecemeal it and try to get as much as we can at the national level focused on trafficking, and then locally focused on really crossover issues. Yeah. Like being a trauma survivor, living through sexual assault, even stuff related to immigrants and refugees. There are so many issues in trafficking cases, stuff related to children and child services, and really you need a lot of training to cover all of these different dimensions, depending on what population you serve.
Yes.
The more specific the population of trafficking survivors you serve, I think you can focus more. Yeah, but because we are sort of the primary service provider for so many of these cases, we really try to do it all. So we try to make sure we know about immigrant refugee specific issues for the not for foreign national victim, the child issues, the sexual assault based issues, all of those. We try to I would say that probably the hardest thing to get training and feel competent about is like labor-based issues, because there's just nothing for labor-based. I mean, labor trafficking gets very little attention.
Yeah.
It really, the focus everywhere is on sex trafficking.
Right.
And whether, for whatever category of sex trafficking, a survivor, foreign national, domestic, child, adult, whatever, I would say that under ID'd or talked about sex trafficking issue is male victims, right? So there's not much about male victims of sex trafficking. And then there's nothing about labor. I mean, it's very hard to get training on labor issues. It's very difficult to find resources for labor unless we're doing it.
Yeah.
And that's very challenging. And it's happening just as often as what I've seen. In labor cases frequently are the ones more likely to have multiple victims, because you have an employer trafficking multiple people, as opposed to a sex case that might only have one victim.
Sure.
And so really, that's really a lot of challenges in doing the labor cases.
Now, your national people, is that mainly Polaris and
Yeah,
maybe
so-
IJM and...
No, we don't use the international folks as much, because the
They're
national
different.
work looks so different.
Yeah, so mainly
So not
Polaris.
IJM. Yeah, Polaris is probably is the primary national group. Shared Hope International, which does domestic minor sex trafficking, but they are very helpful. They have great resources and have done great policy work. Some of the other service providers that are well known nationally, like GEMS in New York. We look at what they do and we try it. We see, we talk to the folks who work there. Like, we invite Rachel to come and recommend her book to folks and read it, to make sure we're doing the best job we can. So we utilize other service providers. I'm just forgetting the name of the place in
you're
LA,
fine.
but there's another nonprofit in LA who's done this work forever, just like GEMS has. CAST, the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking in LA. So we will look to them or invite them out here to come train us. The Justice Resource Institute in Boston, we'll, especially for this curriculum, My Life, My Choice, we looked at people who implemented similar state-level policies like our legislation.
Right.
So we invited folks from Connecticut down, because they passed a lot of these safe harbor laws a few years ago, and we wanted them to tell us how did that go and what were the challenges. So we invited them down to train us on how to implement safe harbor laws.
Yeah.
So that we just
That's
try to
great.
look at who's doing the work, and he has been doing some of the things that we are doing now or trying to do, and we just invite them to come tell us, share with us what you know. There's a great therapist out of Project Reach in Boston. She does psych evals for trafficking survivors and writes those for TVC applications, and she came and trained some of our therapists on how to do those. So we try to just learn from all those national folks. Polaris would be the key one, though, I would say.
I love it. I mean, I love talking about all this. So, what about your agency's philosophy with reunification with their families? What is your agency's philosophy kind of with... Now, I know you said it's all client self-determined, but...
It is. So we just have to follow... So, yeah, it's based on self-determination. I think our internal policy is basically utilize as many resources internally as we have. So utilize our immigration attorneys if they're needed to reunify families, help them file for derivative visas, because our attorneys can do that. We will also utilize, also one international organization that we do utilize is IOM, International Organization for Migration. They have trafficking specific services, and they do reunification. So they're funded to do it. So I guess our other sort of unwritten policy is, okay, find out who's doing the work and is funded to do it and utilize them, right?
That makes us a good social worker, though, right?
You have to. So if we have someone who needs to reunify, we'll do the immigration piece and file for the derivative visas, but we don't have the funding to pay for the travel to bring them here. So once we sort of get through some of the immigration legal things and those things get processed, then we'll go to IOM and utilize their program to actually collaborate with the embassy in home country and help the kids get their exit visas and all that, and they help navigate that process
that
because they're the experts on how to do that. Our policy is use the experts.
Yeah.
Whoever the funded experts are, use them. Use the national hotline because they're experts and they're well funded by Google and everyone. As opposed to establishing our own hotline. We do get some heat for not having our own local hotline in Kentucky.
For Kentucky?
Yeah, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have a hotline. I'm saying we don't have the funding or resources or staff to
who's
do
gonna
it.
staff it?
And Polaris does it really well.
Yeah.
So and it works. And so for now, we'll just do it. So I think our policy is, find out who does it the best and has the money to do it, work with them. And then I think our other policy, I would say, as an agency is really make sure we get it done somehow. Don't let the client suffer because it hasn't been done before. So we really, as an agency, think outside the box. Now, I will say Catholic Charities does work within the realm of the Archdiocese of Louisville. It's a Catholic agency. So in that regard, we do follow, Catholic Charities follows the mission and vision of the Catholic Church, and they follow certain social principles. There's this basic belief in the dignity of every person, including immigrant and foreign national victims of trafficking and other marginalized populations. And so really we very much focus on serving the underserved. And so human trafficking and case management is right in line with that because this is a very underserved population.
Yes, for sure. That's
Now, it does restrict our ability on certain health services. So while we do provide health services, there are certain health services that we will not pay for or officially refer them for. Doesn't mean they can't somehow access them on their own in the community, but we don't officially provide some of those because we're a Catholic agency.
Right, sure.
Which has gotten us in trouble with funders before.
I mean, I could see that in one arena, yeah. Okay. What about the cultural elements and how that affects the aftercare services?
So Catholic Charities is actually so well positioned to do this work, especially with foreign nationals, given our history with migration and refugee services, because that's really what our agency is known for in Kentucky. Not every Catholic Charities in the country is like this, but our agency specifically is known for resettling refugees. So that really positioned us well to do trafficking work. It was actually a fairly seamless crossover into serving foreign national trafficking victims because so many of the needs are the same. They need the ESL, they need the immigration legal services, they need cultural orientation and all those things, and we already provide those.
That's awesome.
So we recognize that those are huge needs. We will provide for them. And we were already sort of well positioned in doing that for certain other populations that we serve. And so we utilize the same things for our trafficking survivors. The ESL school, of course, they don't have to go to ESL classes. It's not mandated, but we highly recommend it. It's especially helpful, I think. Typically what happens with foreign national clients in Louisville Metro anyway, where our ESL school is located, is they're able to go to the ESL classes for the first few months or the first year that they're in services with us. And it's during that time that they're also usually working with the immigration attorney to do immigration legal work. And so while they're sort of waiting to get official permission to work and get status in the country, they're using that time well to learn the culture here, to learn about the community, and to increase their English skills so they're more employable. So we try to sort of use that downtime, which can be a frustrating waiting period for survivors that are foreign out because they really want to work. They really want to be. My experience has been most of my foreign national clients do not want to be dependent on services. I see this very interesting dynamic, I'm generalizing here, between domestic and foreign national clients, where foreign national clients are very uncomfortable getting services. They're not used to the idea of having services available to them. They're maybe from countries where that's not even an option. And they feel oftentimes guilty getting services. They feel like they they feel like they're asking too much of you. They don't want to ask you unless they're completely desperate. Unless sometimes there's children involved and they have no, oftentimes they're just so hesitant to want to ask you for help or to accept your offer. And they want to use your services as little as possible. And as soon as they're able to manage on their own, they want to and they do. So while in some ways I serve them longer because they have these long-term needs, frequently they're the ones that might try to end services as quickly as possible because they don't want to be reliant on services. Whereas my American clients are frequently much more demanding. They're much more demanding and much more comfortable with the idea of getting services. It's a very, and I'm generalizing, but I see this as a trend where that is actually a huge challenge in working with American clients is that whole idea of only providing those needs that they have, not providing everything for them, but only providing the needs that they have that they can't meet on their own in some way for a limited period, with the idea that they start doing that. That's very challenging with American clients, because I've found overall my American clients are much more comfortable with the idea of staying on services or continuing, and might be even more demanding and demand more and get frustrated if they can't get everything that they ask for. It's a very interesting dynamic.
That is interesting.
And it seems to be true with any demographic, younger or older, sex or labor, whatever it is. It just seems to be a difference I see among the foreign nationals versus the American clients. And it's very challenging as the service provider.
It seems like maybe some of that entitlement pieces in some
I'm
areas.
trying not to use that word, but yes, it is.
Creep in.
I don't see entitlement among my foreign national clients ever. I can think of maybe one foreign national client.
Wow, that is very
maybe one.
A very
Actually,
interesting
quite the
perspective.
opposite is true. The problem I have frequently with foreign nationals is because they don't want to ask for help. Which I frequently just say, let me know what you need.
Sure.
Once we've started establishing this plan, and we don't meet weekly, because you're doing well on your own, you let me know what you need. I'm here. My experience has been frequently the foreign nationals will wait until the nth hour.
And they need it right now.
They'll wait until their water's disconnected because they couldn't pay it. Because they didn't want to ask me. And I have to say to them, please ask me early. They wait until they get an eviction notice because they couldn't pay their rent on time, as opposed to asking me early. Because they don't want to, and they're hoping it'll get better, and they don't want to put me out, or whatever they think that they're, my response will be. Whereas my American clients don't have that. I mean, they'll ask me right away and immediately and multiple times, and it's really interesting. I never would have anticipated that difference, but it's very clear. It's very clear, and it's very common.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
I mean, I totally can see it once you start sharing.
I generally get a lot more gratitude from my foreign national clients, and I get a lot more attitude from domestic clients.
Yeah,
I'm generalizing here. I don't know if you can write that in textbook, but I see these differences.
And that's amazing.
That makes treatment. It makes the case management difficult and challenging in some cases.
What about, have you had to deal with any of the shame aspects that come from other cultures with your client here, as far as desire to get reunified with family members or anything like that?
Usually the shame factor plays into whether or not they want to report to law enforcement and make it a more public, go that route, because there is some shame and they don't want to talk about it, especially with a male law enforcement officer, and then at risk going to court. Frequently they fear that their families will find out, and so they want to ask about, is there a way for me to communicate with my family and not have to tell them what happened to me? And we will help them navigate that. It is their story and they own it, and we will respect whatever it is. If there is a worry that if they're going to pursue something legal that they could find out, we want to make sure they know that. So we just try to keep them as informed as possible about what potential outcomes could be, and let them choose what they want to do. Because it's a huge fear. It's a big concern.
And do you see that more with the foreign nationals?
I see it with both, I would say it comes up on a regular basis with the foreign nationals. Frequently, foreign nationals that are from a very conservative culture or have a religious faith. They have a lot of concerns about it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. What would you like to see be changed or altered in your assessment procedures, if anything?
Change or alter in the assessment procedures. I know it's so case by case, because the assessment procedure it differs. We have a screening tool that we use, which is about 5 pages of questions But what we do is we only ask the questions that seem pertinent to that case. We don't ever ask all of the questions of everybody because not all of them are significant for every case, and we can already know that in advance. I mean, as soon as we know if it's foreign, national, or domestic, we can X out a bunch of questions that we don't need to ask them about how did you get to the United States.
Sure.
So in that way, it's kind of nice, the assessment process, because we have the ability to sort of, what's the word, change it, to fit that client. I guess the difficulty for us sometimes is in the referral process, when we get the referral of the case from somebody else, that sometimes it's difficult to get that information from the referral source so that we don't have to re-traumatize them and ask them a bunch of stuff again.
Yeah.
So that's probably one of the difficulties in the assessment process. If we could just easily get that information about what the suspected trafficking at the outset, it just makes it easier for us to sort of move forward without rehashing things with the survivor, which we don't want to do.
Right.
And so it depends on who's referring it to us as to when that's an issue. For example, I frequently have better luck with medical referrals because frequently they have really good records, and as long as I can get the release from my client, which is easy to do, I can get those records, and they document very well what they observed, what the client said to them in dialogue, and I'm able to see all of that, and so that keeps me from having to ask a bunch of stuff again, and I can just put that in my file and refer to that in my assessment. Law enforcement can be more difficult. I mean, if I can get a police report, that's great, but if it's federal, I can't get anything. Very little. So I frequently have to go back and ask them again. Same thing with certain referrals from child service providers, because it's just so closed and I mean, it's sometimes difficult for me as a nonprofit service provider to get access to the information that would keep me from having to ask all these things again.
Yeah.
So if there was some way to sort of streamline that and make it easier or have access, that would be great, because I don't want to re-victimize anyone. I don't want to rehash things again and make them tell it 5 times in order to provide services.
Sure. Yeah. Sort of the same thing with case management. If you could change or alter any pieces of how you currently do case management, or maybe where your hands might be tied, you wish things might be different. Is there anything like with that?
I mean, I wish we had more resources for case management. I mean, I wish money wasn't an object, because sometimes we have to choose what we can or can't do based on access to resources, meaning actual dollars or people, like people power. There's only 2 of us that do full-time casework only on trafficking. We collaborate interagency with other folks that do similar work. If it's sex trafficking and they can get some services through the Rape Crisis Center with an advocate there, we'll do that. But if there's only 2 full-time trafficking advocates in the state, I mean, that's not enough.
No.
And over time our caseload's going to get really big, and right now it's still fairly manageable, but it's difficult. It's difficult when I keep getting new cases, and then I have older clients that I've already worked with before coming to me again for new things. And that happens.
But not new trafficking situations, just they're now ready for services.
They need a different service.
Oh, okay.
Or some tragedy happens.
And it rehashes.
And then they just don't know who to go to. I'm the only person that they know to come to, and I want to be able to respond to them. But that is very difficult when I keep getting new cases, and then I have other clients that I've served for a long time all of a sudden come to me. Well, sometimes it's a simple thing like, can you pay my electric bill? Well, it is simple and it's not simple. Do I have the money to do it? And it's ultimately a simple request. Or now they've gotten their visa finally approved, and so now they need me to help them apply for all the derivative visas. Well, that's a lot trickier.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to manage all of that. So case management, we need more money. We need more people doing the work. We need more locations. I mean, Louisville is not even central to the state, but that's the most. That's where Catholic Charities is, and we're the ones that do the work. So, we need to have other locations, or be able to be more present in other communities in some way. And I had another one, and I lost it. It's gone now. It's gone. But I would say that's probably the key stuff with case management. Maybe being able to provide some more in-house services like the therapy or having the shelter.
So actually have that there.
Yeah, either in-house or just have it available so that we
Especially
can
shelters.
utilize it. Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm not saying that we have to run the shelters. Whatever. There's enough work to go around. I'm happy for another agency
Yeah.
to tackle the issue of shelters.
Yeah, that's a definite need.
But we need them. I don't think DV shelters are the best place for trafficking survivors. They can work occasionally. Certain shelters can. But especially the ones in urban areas that are very full and people are sleeping on, floors, and it's very chaotic, and there's very mixed populations of folks. That can be just as re-traumatizing to somebody as maybe being re-trafficked.
Yes.
So we have to have shelter options, whatever agency is doing it. It doesn't need to be us, but it has to be there. We don't even have access to that right now. I mean, there are some few trafficking shelters around the country. They're always full.
Yeah. No, that is true. Any other elements in the aftercare process or working with survivors that you would like to share?
I think trafficking cases can be